All right, everyone ready? We're going live. Alrighty, so without further ado, I guess I should hit FN. How do you, there's a present button. What am I talking about? All right, so here it is. Oh, whoops. Welcome to Crash Course Godot 3. For those who are following along, make sure that you download this bit.ly link. I might ask someone who is actually streaming to paste that link on the chat at some point. I'm looking at you, Chris. Thank you. Let me know when you're done. It's a simple zip file. Unzip it. Yes. Thank you. It's a simple zip file, just unzip it. Make sure you have Godot installed because we're going to go through the workshop of having a Crash Course Godot 3 experience, I guess. Anyways, so hi, my name is Taro Omiya. You can find me on Twitter at Omiya Games. I make a lot of games. And just earlier, Ludum Dare just closed the ratings, but we got our first Godot game done called Salty Scuttle. And so we're taking everything that we learned and we're teaching you how to use this game engine. So the goal of this game engine is very simple, the goal of this class is very simple. Get comfortable with the Godot game editor. Make sure that we can create an interactive 3D environment. Learn lots of 3D game development terms, and a brief introduction in visual scripting. This does not go extensively into the idea of how to use Godot, what's the philosophy of, it will talk about how to use Godot. That'll be quite against the lesson plan. Anyways, but what I mean to say is it will give you a very introductory look at how to use Godot, but it won't really go into detail on any specific items. That is purposely on design, by design. You know, later, if you want me to go over a couple of specific topics that's available, a couple of specific features that are available on Godot, we can have a separate lesson for that. But in the meantime, we're going to talk about simple stuff. First off, supplementary materials. Here are the materials that I personally used. I highly recommend that YouTube link at the bottom right there. That is pretty much the basis of my lesson, along with the fact that I already had slides called Crash Course Unity 5, so this is just recycled material from that lesson. But that YouTube video in particular, it's actually a series of video with part 1, and then it goes on for like 6 parts on just making a very quick game. But that definitely goes into much further detail than my lesson does, and it is by and far the one that I found the easiest to follow, so it's the one that I highly recommend. Without further ado, let's get started. I created a basic simple project, so we're going to start by actually importing that. When you open Godot, it'll look something like this. This is really small. Like high DPI is not enabled small. Anyways, so it's going to look something like this. And while normally when you're starting a new project, you will click on the new project button and you'll have it define some sort of folder. In this case, we're going to take a quick shortcut by hitting import instead. So if you're following along now, remember to hit the import button, and then we need to actually find this. So according to this folder, it is right now under Downloads Crash Course Godot, under this PC, under the D folder, so we just hit Browse. If you have like a C folder or a D folder, remember to switch it up by hitting this, and then make sure that you're in the proper folder to get there. So in this case, it's under Documents. So far we're in Documents, we don't need that. Documents, Downloads. You know what, I'm just gonna copy and paste this. Oh wow, I think I know why. Doc Systems, Downloads, Crash Course Godot. And then in the folder itself, it should have a project.godot project file. And it's the only one that's selectable. That's totally okay, and you just hit OK. Everyone good so far. And then make sure to hit import and edit. Hold on for a few seconds stream as we have a little bit a student that's trying to follow along. We want to make sure that they're up to speed. So by the way, if you're going through the slides, it's literally me going step by step with this. Also, if you want to follow along the slides on your own as well, we have this available at techvalleygamespace.com/learn. It has already been uploaded. Granted, it's not quite, there were a few more things I was adding to that. I need to add one more thing on that slides actually, so it will be updated later, but the current state as it is, especially for the parts that I plan on going through, is going to be exactly the same, so I would highly recommend checking that out. It is a simple PDF file. There's not a single operating system I know of that cannot open PDF files, so it should be fine. Yep, that's the one. Is he having trouble opening Godot?
No, it's starting to get the assets.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, you just double click on it on Mac.
Okay,
Yeah. He probably put it in the downloads folder, right? I mean, I'm assuming he's using Safari, so that'll put it in the downloads folder. Also, fun fact, Godot is available on Mac, Linux, and Windows. Of course, I put Windows at the lowest priority in this list. Anyways, so since it's available on all three platforms, there's really no reason not to check it out. It is also completely free, and it's an open source project, so yeah. I'm gonna actually move forward a little bit since most of it is just a bunch of random notes. I'm not gonna be going over the project quite yet. Yes? So real quick, here are the license for the models and the textures that we'll be using. You know, it's Creative Commons 3.0, classic stuff. I did modify it a little bit. So about Godot 3. Godot 3 is what you see is what you get game engine for both 3D and 2D. It was actually started as a 2D game engine, but later on they started adding in 3D features to it. And it has some really interesting philosophy on how to make games out of it. It has a lot of built-in features, including physics. It uses Bullet for 3D, sound, scripting, gamepad support, plugins, and more. And it builds many platforms as well, to PC, Mac, Linux, WebGL, iOS, Android, Windows 10, you know, the usual. The license. it is under the MIT license, which for those not in the know is a free open source license, which means that you can actually look for the GitHub repository and edit the Python/C++ code if you want to and recompile it for your own purposes. There are some actual legit companies that do that. You know, you can build it to all these platforms. It does have VR support as well and AR support. This is a fairly recent addition, but then again, Godot 3 is a fairly recent version of the game engine anyways. It does have C# support if you're going through the directions I asked earlier, which is download it on Steam. Steam version does not have, as I recall it, C# support, unfortunately. I may be wrong on that. At least I don't recall a script that I can add. But if you do plan on grabbing the C# support, you can just go to their official website at Godot. I think it's just godot.org. And on there, it has what's called a mono version. Now, if you're going for the mono version, do read the requirements very carefully. It does have some dependencies. It expects you to download the mono binaries as well as a couple of other things for it to properly run the C# scripts. Frankly, the scripting language that's much easier to learn is the GD script, which has a very Python-like syntax. And finally, it also has visual scripting, which is the scripting version that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be using visual scripts in this case. In my opinion, I would recommend you using the GD script wherever possible. But you know, visual script also is something that anyone can get started with, even if you don't have any programming experience. So we're going to be starting with that. There are a couple of also extensions available for grabbing actual Python support, the D language support, etc. And finally, it is totally okay to sell your game if you've made it. No royalty fees, no nothing. It's an open source project. There's no reason to open source your own project because it's an MIT license. So even if you made changes to the editor, like you made C++ changes to it and made your own editor to it, the project is not going to ask you for making those contributions at all. All right, let's start with making a game. So in theory, once you click on import and edit, everyone should be seeing this sort of screen. Ooh, I'm gonna go a little bit on a tangent here. High DPI mode, high DPI. See if that does anything. I guess not. Okay, never mind. So this is the editor. I'm not going to go too far into it, but what we're going to do basically is we're going to try to kind of learn as we go along how this editor layout goes. So with that in mind, the first thing we're going to try to do is actually set up the current scene that we have. So we're going to do something very simple. We're going to go to scene, and we're going to say save scene. And then what you're going to get is you're going to get a pop-up that says this operation cannot be done without a tree root. So wait, what just happened? We were just trying to save a file, and then suddenly Godot is complaining at us, right? So, and also the button is IC because that's an important detail. So what the heck is happening with this? Well, as it turns out, on the right-hand side, there is absolutely nothing listed. A requirement on every single scene file, which is basically any sort of level file, scene file in Godot, is that it requires what's called a root node. So what we need to do is we need to basically create exactly one tree root node by simply clicking on that plus button under the scene dock. So here it is, here's the plus button, just click on it, and holy crud, there's this big, gigantic pop-up dialog. Trust me, it's not that intimidating. Most of the time, you're just going to be searching. But in this case, the first thing that we want to grab is spatial. So we just click on spatial. It says at the bottom, the most basic 3D game object, parent of all 3D related nodes. We're just going to select that and click create. And that's going to create the spatial, along with this weird gizmo on the middle of the screen, in the scene dock. So long as you're seeing this, we're probably going to want the magnifying glasses. Magnifier. Yeah, look at that. Look at that. Here we go. So long as you have the spatial appearing, then we're all good. All right, so as a quick aside, by the way, if you don't like the layout of this, what you can do is you can click on these little 3 dots, and it'll give you the dock position. Okay, we'll probably want to zoom in that one too. It'll give you the little dock position widget that lets you adjust where that scene dock gets docked into. I'm not going to do it for this tutorial, but just to let you know that exists. If you want to revert it back to its original state, there's editor layout, and then if you select default at the very bottom right here, it'll basically place the dock at a different location. So if I can put the scene right here if I wanted to, then I can revert it by just going to editor and then say default. So cool. Anyone who's actually familiar with Unity, the Unity equivalent of a node is a game object, but Godot does not have an equivalent of components. Each node has exactly one functionality and one functionality only. So if you're thinking to yourself, oh, I get to use this like Unity, the answer is no. You cannot have multiple components on a single node. But in a lot of ways, that actually kind of makes certain things a little easier to understand, and other things a little harder to set up. We're going to go over those in a moment. Every entry in the, oh, this is a misnomer. It says hierarchy, that should be scene. Every entry in the scene dock is a node. So this right here is a node. We have the first node right up there, perfect. And remember that the scene requires exactly one tree node. So the scene is Godot's term for basically a list of nodes. That's just it. In reality, like the way scenes are practically used are for creating new levels. So when you're trying to switch between different scenes, or if you want to switch between different levels, excuse me, I got my terms incorrect, you'll be basically switching between different scenes. And they have a file extension of TSCN. There's also a few other file extensions that technically count as scenes, but TSCN is the one we usually recommend because that's in text. And if you're going to be sharing your files between different team members, then the text version is usually the best method. And finally, assets. Any sort of files we're going to be adding into, or any sort of like outside files that are created off of Photoshop or Blender or Maya or any sort of external application are called assets as far as Godot is concerned. And they're just any files that are used in the games, any media files. And that's basically anything for Godot, anything that falls under the project folder that we're in right now. So let's start setting up the project. Let's actually save the scene one more time just to confirm that we got everything working. Again, that's as simple as clicking scene and then clicking save scene. And then you'll get this dialog. That's good because we didn't get the pop-up anymore. And then we just had to give our scene a name. So I am going to call it, where's my magnifying glass? So I'm going to call this scene main level. Save. Is there a way to, okay, I guess that's one way of doing it. And you might notice something a little different on the left side dock right here. The main level.scene that you just created appeared right below it. So as it turns out, the left side of the screen, this whole left side of the screen is actually the file system dock. It displays any content that are inside a project. So in this case, there's right now res, which is actually the root folder. And then there's also assets. And if you click on that, you get all these sort of assets that actually exist, as it turns out, right here in this folder right as well. These are all the assets. And basically anything that Godot can use is listed right under as files under the bottom right here. Whoops. So let's actually get started on real game making right here. We need to add a model to our game. So if you click on the assets folder, as I have done right here, you get all these lists right here. We're going to look for what's called the level.obj file, and we're just going to drag that into the middle of the level and drop it right there. Ta-da! We got our first model in our scene. Let's get that started. So I'm going to wait for a few minutes to make sure that everyone can catch up to this. Oh. So click on Assets folder. This exposes all the files inside that Assets folder. Drag and drop level object into the scene. Into the editor, excuse me. Now, it's going to appear really blue because the skybox is blue. And right now, because we added absolutely no lighting into the scene, you know, it's just going to appear like the color of the sky. So, yay. Obviously, we want to fix that. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on that plus button on the scene again, scene dock at the very right. And we're going to actually use this search bar on the very top. We're going to actually utilize that by typing in light. You're going to get a couple of different lights here. We want the directional light, and we want to just create that. So let's get started. Boop. Here is the plus button. I'm just going to hit plus, and I'm going to search for light, who is the Kila of Death Note, and then click create. And then great, we have this light right here, which is fantastic. And then what we can do, there's these little rings around that light. By the way, notice that the directional light is selected here in the scene. There's these little ring lights. You can, once you hover your mouse over it, it highlights that ring. And then you can click and hold that and drag it around to change the direction of that directional light. So feel free to play that around to your own heart's content. And then once you feel a little more comfortable with what you have, we can get started with the next set of tasks to do.
Where do we get the light from?
Oh. Remember to click on the plus button if you haven't added it in yet. And then search for light at the very top. Oops. Search for light at the very top. And then what we want is the directional light. And then click create. Yep. I'm going to cancel because I already created this light and there's no reason for me to make two lights. Did everyone create a light in your scene? Is anyone not able to follow along yet? All right, cool. So I said models. I didn't really explain what those are. Models is basically an industry-wide term for any sort of 3D sculpture files. In short, it's a sculpture. It actually can contain a bunch of animations as well as rigging information. In this case, we're obviously not creating any, so we really don't need to worry about that. And they're usually made in a specialized application, such as Maya, Blender, 3ds Max, that kind of stuff. Do you have a question?
Can I interrupt and ask you basic navigation in the...
Yes! Before I do that, however, let me talk about what 3D models Godot can import. It can import Collada, which comes in DAE format. Obviously, OBJ formats, as we just... is Wavefront called OBJ? I didn't know that. OBJ formats. And then it can also import the GLTF 2.0 formats as well. All of these exporters are available on Blender, not pre-installed. You actually have to download the plugins to make that happen. So if you happen to be using that, they can be exported. But one thing you might notice that's missing here is that FBX is missing. Godot cannot import FBXs. As far as I'm concerned, it seems like they have no plans on doing so. So with that in mind, remember that if you're going to be exporting something, you probably want to export it in GLTF, which is Collada, which is currently the most mature importer on Godot. GLTF is a fairly recent addition, and right now they're kind of pushing for that, but they did also say that they're kind of working out a few bug fixes on the importing of that file.
It's a JSON file.
Hmm?
It's a JSON file.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yes. About lighting, so we added in a directional light. Directional light is basically just sunlight. You know, it makes the light move in a parallel direction. And then OmniLight. OmniLight, as the light bulb icon implies, is basically a light bulb. The light emits in all 360 direction. And then there's Spotlight, which kind of gives you this flashlight effect. So it gives a cone of light. By the way, if you haven't noticed, what you're working with is called the scene editor, not the scene pane, another typo on my part. So the scene editor, as the name implies, is basically the editor for adding any sort of objects inside the scene, as well as moving things around and so forth. Anytime you're selecting something in the scene editor, it will also be selected inside the scene dock as well. And that also works and vice versa. So if you select on the directional light, then that also selects the item on the editor as well. Navigating the scene pane. This is how you do it. So I'm assuming you have 3 buttons on your computer. I apologize, I don't know how 2 buttons work. I tried all my research on it and I couldn't find a documentation on it. So apologies, but if you're wondering what the 3-button mouse looks like, it's the one with the scroll wheel. Almost every single button, it's called 3 mouse button because the scroll wheel can actually be pushed down. Anyways, left mouse click to actually select something, simple enough. Hold the right mouse button to rotate the camera around the camera position, or whatever is the selected position right here. Oh, that's the right mouse button, excuse me. There we go. That's what I was looking for. I think if you hold this and you use a WASD, it will let you kind of fly around as well. I totally forgot to write that down on the slides, but just to let you know, you can do that too. Scroll wheel to zoom in and out, that's just scroll up and down, and that allows you to zoom in and out to whatever is the focus location. And then likewise, clicking and holding on the scroll wheel to rotate the camera around the point that you're focused on. If you hold shift and hold down the scroll wheel, that allows you to pan in any sort of direction. So pan, hold shift, and then the middle mouse button. Yep. So you have to use a key modifier. So far, so good?
Yes.
Other things I should probably mention. So right up here in the upper left-hand corner are the different controls. If you're used to Unity, you should be incredibly familiar with what each of these controls do, with an exception of the leftmost one. The leftmost one is actually the one that gives you, oh, oops, I didn't mean to do that. The leftmost one is actually supposed to give you controls, all the controls available with these 3 other ones. So it's the super control, where you can see these little arrows can be used to move the directional light around, which does absolutely nothing because every light in directional light is perpendicular. There's obviously these little turning nodes, and then there should be, oh, there isn't. Never mind, there is no scaling node. But if you want to do scaling, here's the scale button. Ooh, excuse me, here's the scale button, and that allows you to increase the size of directional light in any way. The keyboard shortcuts in Unity also applies in Godot as well. Q is controls for all. W gives you controls for translating or moving an object around. E is for rotating, and R is for scaling. If you want to toggle the reference point of how you're rotating from global to local, you just click on this little button right here, this button right here. So now, when you look at it, the reference of the nodes are in a completely different direction because it's now rotated in the same axis as that directional light itself. And finally, the play game controls is all on the upper right-hand corner. If you hit the play button, that'll let you, which if you do that, absolutely nothing will happen because there's no camera. It'll play the project. There's the pause button, the stop button, the play current scene button. If you happen to be editing a specific scene and you don't want to go through playing through the game and getting to the level that you want, then you can just hit the play scene button and that'll jump to the current scene that you're editing. And play custom scene, which if you click on this and you have multiple scenes, you get to select which scene you want to load. All right, so right now this, this level looks very, very dire, as in very, very, very pale. So with that in mind, what we want to do is we want to actually add what's called materials. And we do that by selecting the mesh instance right here, or selecting just a level alone should do the job. Are you not clicking? Okay, well, mesh instance is right here. Here it is, mesh instance. And then under the mesh instance, there is a group, a group called materials. We just have to expand that. And you might say two of them, it says null. Null just simply stands for absolutely nothing. We're going to want to create some stuff here, so we're going to click on this left little trigger right here, and that brings down the drop-down menu. We're going to want to choose new spatial material. So we're going to create a new spatial material, and we're going to actually do that for both materials. Doop. So you might notice, hey, our level looks even paler than before. Yay! I don't know what that accomplished, Taro. Yes, good question. I don't know what that accomplished either. But it is a good, important thing that we did this, because if we want to make edits to those materials, then counterintuitively, you're supposed to click on the material itself. There you go. And so that alone makes this inspector. You might notice the breadcrumb right here that it originally had the mesh instance, and now it's opening up to the spatial material. That brings up the prop inspector for the properties of the spatial material itself. And one of these is albedo. Albedo simply stands for color. And it's looking for a texture right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to drag the grass texture into the texture node, texture properly right here. And lo and behold, we now have grass. If you want to return back to the spatial material, or back to the mesh instance property, so that you can edit the other material to add rocks to it, you just simply hit this weird left arrow, like so, and that'll bring you back to the mesh instance. And then you just click on the material right here, expand albedo, and that lets you fill in the rocks. See, that's much more like it.
Can we take that to inspectors and materials?
Right here. So I know that was a little difficult to follow, but let me know, please raise your hand and let me know if you need any help in getting to this point. So try selecting the mesh itself. So you need to expand the materials. And then here, right now it's going to say null, which doesn't really help, but here it says new spatial material. You're going to want to create new spatial material. You're going to want to do that.
You want to turn on the lights?
And then just click on the actual material itself. So that one is also a set of box, but expand Elmedo. And then see how it says texture right there, dragging the rock off. Okay. Yeah, we're going in the box. You're dragging the rock. No, rock can just shape it right there. There we go. Then just dragging the rock into the texture. And then go back. And then do the same thing for that, except with the grass texture. Anyone else need help? Yes. Huh? Because it's such a specular. So I actually need this slide and don't even bother to explain it. But the reason why it's blue is because the skybox is blue. And also because I'll see if I have time to go over it and slides. But I am just going to go over it on this. What's going on?
Something about the
Resources was import, so it's not editable. Change of sign, import when changes may be lost. Oh, it must be something different. So let's go over this again. Let's go through this. Alright. So you selected the mesh, which is good. You got that first part right. But what you didn't notice was that under Inspector there's a materials group. So click on that and that expands this. On the right hand side there's a little arrow going like the new spatial material. No, on top. There we go. And then click on that material. And then expand it all that. And then drag and drop in this case, you don't need to change the color.
Back.
Just click outside. There we go. And then go through here. There's a grass.png. Drag and drop that under the texture. You drag and drop that under the color. You want to put it on the texture. There we go. And now you want to go back real quick. Oh, that did it for you. Do the same thing here. Remember spatial material. Click on that first. Non-right property. All that up.
Much to remember.
There we go. And so now you have materials. Was there anyone else that was able to, that was not able to follow along? All right. So there was a question about why it's very blue. I don't go over this in the slides, but if you want to fix it, you just click on the material itself. And actually, there's a lot of properties right here. Probably the property you're looking for is roughness and metallic. If you set to metallic, you might notice that the specular is set to 0.5. Specular stands for how much light it reflects. In this case, we probably want to set the grass to 0, and then we want to set the roughness all the way to 1. So if you're curious what the 0 and 1 stands for, 1 is 100%, 0 is 0%. So I did that for the grass, and it gives you an effect that looks like this, which obviously looks a lot more realistic than what we had previously. I like the rock being shiny, so I'm going to leave that alone. Alrighty. So the inspector doc. While you're working on that, I'm just going to go through this really briefly. The inspector doc basically provides all the properties and the details of a specific node on a scene tree. One can edit the property by simply clicking on it and then going through expanding expanding your properties and doing whatever, changing the values as necessary. Some properties do have another inspector, as you notice the materials do. So if doing so, there's these 2 arrow key buttons right here on the upper right hand side. You just use that to navigate it like any sort of web browser, with the left side being going back and then right arrow going forward. And then also, since I talked about materials and textures without actually describing what the heck they are, materials are an industry-wide term for what the quality of the surface of that model is supposed to be. So by quality of the material, we're talking like how shiny it is, how rough it is, how much light it reflects, is it reflective at all, that kind of stuff. In Godot, materials can be either embedded inside an object itself, inside a node itself, or it can be saved as a separate file. In this case, I'm going to go with a preference of just embedding it directly inside a node. But if you're looking for actually creating a separate file, which there's a good reason to do so, you probably want to have a couple of different objects that you want to have share the same material, there is a way to do so. I'm not going to go over it for this lesson, but just to let you know, there is a way. Models retain information on how the materials are mapped to its surface. What I mean by this is when you're creating your model on, say, Blender or whatever, you get those applications. You can let it know that these so-and-so faces are supposed to have so-and-so material. Textures. Texture is an industry-wide term for images that represents how a model is supposed to be painted. You know, it's just an image that's mapped on a 3D object. How it's being mapped is decided on whatever external application you're using to map it on top of that surface. In Godot, I could not find any documentation on what textures it can import. So this is from experimentation what I can tell it can import, which is PNGs and JPEGs. I'm under the impression it can import PSD files, but I have not had a confirmation of it. I haven't tried. That's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm under the impression they can, but I'm not certain. Oh, it did not. Oh, darn it. No. Okay, so it does not import PSD files. Well, there's always PNGs, right? All right, so let's add a camera. We already added the lights. We have the level. Now we're going to add action and camera. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the assets. And in here, I created what's called an FPS controller.tscn. TSCN, excuse me. So just drop this like you normally would. And there you go. You have your wonderful camera.
Hey, so right there, you just drag it into the scene, and like, it's sort of annoying that, like, how can you place things better? I couldn't drag things into the scene area. Like, I couldn't make it a child. I couldn't drag it in there. Like, is there no better way?
Instead of just like floating in the air, you actually just drag it onto the ground.
Yeah, I think.
So that just to the ground. I don't know.
So what you're asking is, I just dragged and dropped in this case. You wanted to change its child.
Like if you drag it into that like hierarchy of the scene thing.
Oh yeah, you can do that too. Like just drop. Oh no, you can't do that. Okay, interesting.
That's what I tried to do.
So it is possible to just drag and drop them out like this.
If you drag it right on top of the spatial thing, it seems to go.
Yeah, if you have whatever node you happen to have highlighted, that is where when you drop an item into the scene, that is what it's going to child to.
Oh, you can have it on the spatial node. The parent node in the scene you can drop things onto?
Yeah. You just have to click on spatial under the scene dock and then just drop the FPS controller that way. In this case, it doesn't really matter in the hierarchy sense right now. You just have to close. Is it running out of batteries? It probably is. Yeah, I think it just ran out of battery. You probably also want to switch it up to ether, by the way. So far, so good. So now that you have this, let's play it. I mean, we got the camera, we got the level, we got the light, and wait, whoa, what the heck? What's going on with this? It says, no main scene has ever been defined. Select one. You can change it later in project settings under application category. So yes, that is right. According to Godot logic, what you need is you need to have a scene assigned inside the project settings. So this is actually really simple. It actually gives you a quick shortcut by just hitting select. And then when you hit select, it says pick a main scene. Obviously, we have one single scene that we just edited right here. So we're going to select that and say open. It saves that scene. Here's our Godot thing. And, oh, right. That looks wonderful. That's a really nice site right there. So for those who completely missed it, I'm going to play it again. It's not going to give me that error anymore. And I just went right through the ground. While everyone is actually going through that direction real quick, just to let you know, project settings is simply right here under project.project settings. And then under config, it's not config, I guess, run? Yes, run, right here, main scene. Here it asks for what scene to run. So this is actually what you're setting when you actually press play and then select. Is everyone good so far? Is everyone falling through the ground graciously? How's it going? So yeah, just click play at the very top. Yep. And it's going to say you run on to this, say select, and then say open. It shows the right one. So, error. Oh, well, that worked. That's what matters. And you can close this. This is on purpose. Everyone good? Did you okay? So what happens when you play the game? So you have to do this. Okay, select. And then you already add a spatial LTC. There we go. You did. Good job. So you'll need to close this. So what are we missing? Long story short, we're missing what's called a collider. I'm going to go into detail later about what that means. But in this case, what we need to do is we need to actually select the level itself. Here it is. I'm selecting the mesh instance. You can tell because the upper right-hand corner, the mesh instance is highlighted. But in this case, all we need to do, there's a quick shortcut. You just hit on mesh right here. Right here at the top of the editor, there is a mesh. Just click on that and say, create tri-mesh static body. Ta-da! And when you do that, you might notice that it created a static body and a collision shape. So now try playing the game again. And there you go. Now we can actually play the game. The controls are simple. Use the mouse to look around, WASD to move, left click to shoot. There's also sound. That is not going to get annoying. So yeah, it's really just a very simple thing I created for you. By the way, for those following along and asking a question of can I use this for my game, the answer is yes. It's probably not my best work, so I really don't care too much. Pew, pew, pew. Pew, 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 pew. If you fall down, you can always just close it.
No, just switch that.
So while you're all enjoying that, a quick lexicon review. What the heck are colliders? It's an industry-wide term for shape representing the boundary of an object. And it's used by the physics engine to determine how objects are supposed to collide with each other. It's just it. Really simple thing. There are a couple of different types of collider nodes. You just saw one of them, which is called here static body, as well as collision shape. But anyway, static body is a node for handling any sort of non-interactive objects. Basically, no physics is applied to it. Gravity is not applied to anything, nothing like that. According to Godot's documentation, apparently it can be animated, which is an interesting detail, despite the fact that it can't move. It also, for it to properly operate, require at least one collider node under its children for it to do anything. We're actually going to see this being demonstrated later on in the slides, but keep that in mind. There's also collision shapes. Collision shapes, as the name implies, is simply the shape of the collider itself. And then there's the collision polygon. where the polygon shape can be defined by the user. Real quick, in regards to the collision shape, it can be generated from the model's data, as we just used with our quick and handy shortcut, but it also has a couple of predefined shapes as well, whereas collision polygon doesn't have any of those. So yeah, let's actually start by talking a little bit about some pre-made assets. In this case, we used, you know, a model just straight up from our own model that I created. But in this case, there are a couple of models that already exist inside the game engine itself, and we're going to get started on actually using those. Just to make sure, did everyone make it to a point where you can actually land on top of your level? If you have not, please raise your hand. Huh? You, huh? So select the mesh, and then hit the mesh on top of there. No, there's more. And then there's a create try mesh static body. So it's just then it just creates a child node. And I was just talking about did it work for you too? I misremembered your oh, so so it looks like you haven't added the colliders yet. That's not quite. Select our mesh instance. It's not going to be in the assets folder. Hold your horses, go back to your scene, and then click on mesh instance. Alright, so yeah, just have to click on mesh in this case. And then create try mesh static. Now I can play the game. Oh, right. And then you can use the left mouse button to move it around and get to the location, and then you can left click shoot. Yeah, that's basically it. All right, so adding pre-made graphics, it's really, oh, yeah. Actually, Will, you're pre-call up, so you're good. So yeah, let's talk about adding pre-made graphics. So earlier, I've been using the method of just clicking on the plus button to create a new child node, and that is actually really useful. But personally, I prefer just right-clicking. I'm going to right-click on spatial in this case and selecting add child node this way. At least that, to me, is an easier way of memorizing, oh, I specifically selected this node, therefore it's going to create a child there. So that's the method I personally recommend. There's also Control A. Thank you for telling me that shortcut. That actually would have been useful for me knowing during the time of the game jam. But anyways, so you can just select that. And what that obviously will do is it will create a new big, gigantic list of nodes that you can select. And I highly recommend checking out, especially under spatial and controls. Controls, by the way, is anything UI related. I highly recommend checking out what each of these do at some point. You can just kind of select them and see the description. But in this case, what I'm going to go for in this is spatial. And I'm looking for mesh instance. Okay, apparently it's not there. Well, you can always search it too. Mesh instance. It's under visual instance, geometry instance, then mesh instance. Navigation mesh instance is not what you think it is. For those not in the know, navigation mesh instance is there for pathfinding. And pathfinding is a really quick and easy fancy word for AI in determining what is the shortest path to get to you or get to point B or whatever. But anyways, just select mesh instance and say create. And that creates a mesh instance. If you tap F, that allows you to zoom into that location. But there's no graphics here, which is not very useful. But as it turns out, right here on the upper lower right-hand corner is the mesh. You can click on the arrows to kind of see all sorts of different meshes that comes in pre-made. In this case, actually, oh, there's a new array mesh. I didn't know about that. In this case, I'm going to use the cube mesh. But feel free to choose whichever mesh you feel like choosing. I'm going to go with the cube mesh in this case. And there it is. We got our cube. Nice and fancy and dancy. Now, we know from the previous exercise of us falling through the ground that if we don't add a collider to this box, you know, it's not going to, any sort of bullet is not going to collide to it. You could potentially just choose mesh and then create a tri-mesh static body. But the method I'm going to recommend if you're already using pre-made graphics is by right-clicking on the mesh instance itself, selecting Add Child Node. And then that created a static body. So we're going to look for the static body here. Here it is, static body. We're going to create that. And then right now, if you selected that, it's complaining at you, hey, you know, this node has no children's shapes, so it can't interact with the space. Consider adding a collision shape or a collision polygon child node to define its shape. You can find more of those details by simply clicking on the exclamation point. Whoops. The yellow exclamation point right here, which it'll actually just highlighting it flat out will tell you as well. But that'll give you the detail as to what the heck is going on. So in fact, if you were to play this game right now, and then you were to shoot at this, your bullets will just fly through the cube. So we just need to add a child node under the static body as its warning implied. Come on. There we go. And then we need to add in another collision shape or a collision polygon. In this case, I'm going to use collision shape. I don't know of many instances where collision polygon is preferred, but anyways, collision shape. And then collision shape, again, has another warning. It says a shape must be provided, or else it there is no definition. And actually, this is the same problem as we had last time, where the mesh had no shape whatsoever. And as it turns out, here it is. Hey, it's a shape. So we just need to expand that and select the same equivalent shape that we created for the mesh. In this case, I created a box, therefore I want a box shape. And there we have it. We have it done. You can just play the game. And I can look for this cube and start shooting at it. And then my bullets will bounce off. Good stuff. Oops, let's close that. So you might be asking, okay, that was a longer method of basically creating exactly the same thing we did for the level. Why do this at all? And the short answer is because the tri-mesh collider that we created for works great for complex shapes, because Lord knows you don't want to go through defining each and every single shape on that thing. But it is also kind of more costly to use tri-mesh collider. Using these pre-made collision shapes is a lot faster, especially with cubes and spheres. So generally speaking, if something is going to be used very often, or something is meant to be pushed around, those shapes does a much better job performance-wise. By the way, I didn't go over this earlier, but you can actually have more collision shapes as children, and the static body itself will actually take that information into account. But in this case, what we want to do instead, I mean, we really don't want a floating cube, let's just say, for right now. What we want is a cube that you can push around and be like a true cube crate. You know, the game review with crates that tells you that the better the game is, you know, the less likely you're going to encounter a crate within the first couple of seconds. So anyways, with that in mind, let's start making this cube actually react to bullets and gravity. And as it turns out, it's really simple to do so. You just have to simply right-click on the static body that was originally created right here, right-click on it, and say, no, I want you to be something different. I want to change type. And in this case, what we want to change type to is we want to change the type to rigid body. For those that taken the Unity course, you probably know exactly what rigid body stands for. But in any case, let's just select that and then click Create. And the icon of the static body changed. It's not giving us any warnings. Therefore, it must work, right? So here's our cube right here. If we shoot at it, oh, no, never mind, it's not working. Our bullets is going right through the cube. But there's also the ground below the cube. And you might notice that that was a really subtle effect right there, but a bullet actually reacted to something. It looked like it actually hit something. Yes, question. Anyone not caught up yet? Well, without further ado, let's keep going. So, yeah, that is not great. What do we do about that, you might be asking? Well, as it turns out, there's a very simple thing you can do. What's going on, in fact, is that the rigid body is doing exactly what it was told to do. But when you look at the hierarchy, it's a child of the mesh instance. And so what's going on is that, well, it's better to just actually demonstrate it. Let's change the configuration of this. So in this case, I'm going to drag the static body a little bit upward so that, whoops, let me do that over. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the static body a little bit upwards and have it so that this blue line appears in between FPS controller and mesh body. If you do move it up a little bit, you might notice that that line gets a little shorter. Don't let that happen. Just leave it to the full length. And that moves the static body up a little bit in the hierarchy. But what's more important is that it changes it to the parent. It changes the parent to spatial. And then now I'm going to move the mesh instance under the static body. It can be a child of a collision shape. It can be a child of a collision body. It doesn't matter which. And once you get that, try playing the game again. Oh. And then what you might notice is that, hey, the cube actually fell. And then I can poke it with my gun if I wanted to. I can also shoot at it. Yeah, look at that really convincing collision. So you can kind of create yourself a target. Oh, it's really not liking the bullets. Oh, it fell through the ground. But yeah, feel free to try that and see if that works. Yep, no problem.
Taro, are there like any defaults aside from these primitives, are there any like you had this FPS controller, but I guess you made that.
Yes, I did.
So are there any like assets that you can just toss and put together?
Oh, good question. Short answer, kind of. Long answer, there's at the very top of the screen, there's an asset list. That runs up the store, quote unquote. And so you can import anything from there.
Did I move the right static/rigid body?
It does not look like it
It
is.
does not.
Yes. So, actually, just look on the lower right mesh instance. Yeah. Okay. So this is the static body right here. It's called static body, but that's in the small one. You can actually click on that and change the.
Yeah, it's still names.
Right. Exactly. But you can, so that's something I should have pointed out. So you might notice that the name static body remain, even though you change it to a rigid body, the names are customized. So you can actually change that to whatever you want.
Okay, so my static body.
So yeah, leave that static body. Just drag the static body up. Yeah, feel free to. Sorry. Close enough. Drag it above the mesh instance. Right there. Then now drag the mesh instance above. Into the original body. So you highlight that and drag it and see how it highlights the entire thing. So that makes it a child. And then when you play that, you can shoot at the. There you go. Mike, you have a question. What was your problem? Okay, so you have the static body, you placed it right there in the mesh, that's fine. What's wrong with it? Yeah. Oh, by the way, collision shape, if I'm back real quick. Oh, that's why. Expand direction. Expand static body. Click on collision shape there. Okay, that's correct. Click on collision shape there. Okay, that's the result. So shape. Click back. And change that to cube. You want cube. Box shape. There we go. I'm going to try and get that and see if we can do it. Yeah, your mouse actually has to be a little bit less bad. There it goes. So you chose the wrong shape, and that's why it visually did not connect, because the square shape was completely different from the graphic itself. Did you get? Did everyone here get the shooting working so that you can actually shoot on the collision? Patrick? Were you able to get the shooting working?
Let's see.
Oh, so you haven't created a cube yet.
Cube. Where's the cube?
Do you mind if you can step in through that? Or was it working on your It's working for everyone else, right? And then, right, I answered your question with there's nothing really built in over to the engine itself. They try to keep it as small as possible. So that's kind of an intentional decision on their part. All right, so we got an interactive cube. That's cool. Or sphere. Let's talk about it. So, you know, you might be asking the question, okay, Taro, what is a rigid body? Rigid body is an industry-wide term indicating that an object is interactable. That means that they react to gravity, if you have one. You can also tell it to not react to gravity. So that if you want to create a space game, that's a good situation where that's important. Basically, it contains information such as mass, drag, center of gravity, that kind of stuff. It also obviously contains the information of what the shape is supposed to be. And it turns a group of colliders, these are all children of the rigid body, into basically a single interactable shape. I'm not going to go over into more detail about this. I would recommend experimenting it on your own time. But you can actually kind of get creative with this if you want to. Child and parent, for that matter, is an industry-wide term for any object where the position scale and the rotation follows exactly what the parent object, or parent node in this case, does. So in Godot, they appear as nested entries. These are nested entries right here. You can expand and contract them. And basically, they follow the parent, and all the children basically follow the parent whenever its translation changes. So the reason why this worked, the whole static body being a parent of the mesh instance, and the other configuration didn't work because the other configuration had the mesh instance, the graphic as the parent of the rigid body. But the rigid body is the one that's actually moving, right? So if the child is moving but the parent is not programmed to follow it, then you see this discrepancy where the graphics does not follow the collider. By switching it out so that the thing that actually moves, the rigid body, is moved to the top of the hierarchy, and then having the graphic, the mesh instance, be a child of it, make it so that the graphics will follow what the physics object is saying it should do. Does that make sense? No? All right, let's add sound effects. Huh? Yes. So if you're trying to create any interactive objects, it's better to have a rigid body as a parent. Yeah, let's talk about sound effects. Yay! Sound effects are really easy to do. We're going to put it as a child of the static body because, or rigid body. You know what? I'm just going to rename it. You can just long click on it and it'll give you the option to name something. So yeah, let's just, huh? Yeah. You know what? That's a good point. Box. Ross. So anyways, you can just right click on here and say add child node. We're going to add a sound effect that follows the box wherever possible. And in this case, we're going to look for what's called audio stream. So I'm going to search for audio stream. And then there's audio stream player 2D, audio stream player, and audio stream player 3D. We're making a 3D game. Which one do we want? 3D. And we're just going to leave it alone here for now. What you might notice is that under stream, it says null. It's expecting a file there. So we just need to drag and drop basically some sort of sound effect file. And we can do that with, I'm going to go with hit wave and just drag it, drop under stream. So far, everyone follow? Now, when you press play, you're not going to hear it. So it's like, okay, how do I actually play sound in the Godot? Well, as it turns out, just like Unity, you have to script it. So it's actually, scripting behind Godot is actually really simple. You just click on the node that you want to add the script to, and then you click on the scroll to add that script. So in this case, we want to, I'm going to add it on Box Ross, excuse me. We're going to add it on Box Ross, and we're going to click on the scroll right here. So I'm going to zoom in. Again, Box Ross is selected and hitting the scroll. Woo! And that's going to bring up this pop-up right here. On this pop-up, I'm not going to really care too much about the name of the pop-up, but in here it says language. You can select between different languages, including whatever the heck native script is, GD script, which is what I personally recommend programming in Godot, and then there's Visual Script. We're going to be using Visual Script this time around, make it beginner friendly. It inherits a rigid body because we just selected a rigid body. And then finally, there's a bunch of templates. We're going to leave that alone. Built-in scripts, we're going to leave that off. Path, this is the name of the script. And I'm just going to leave it as Box Ross because why not? And we're going to say create. And here it is. You might notice that the window has changed. If you want to return back to the 3D, you just click on 3D. Done. If you click on script, it will bring up a window with all the scripts appearing on the left side bar right here. We just created Box Ross, and there's absolutely nothing in it. So right now it's complaining at us saying select or create a function to edit the graph. Well, we're not going to do, well, we will be selecting a function first, but just to make sure, has everyone followed through all the way to here? Incidentally, you might notice that when you go to our scene doc, there is now a script scroll icon. You can click on that and it basically brings up this window. It's really simple. So far, so good? I'm going to walk around the room as an excuse to grab a drink. All right. So we're going to talk about a new doc that allows you to create triggers. All right, so what we're going to do is we have Box Ross right here. Great, awesome. Select it again, make sure that it's highlighted. But what we're going to do a little different is that right here under the inspector, to the right of it is this weird tab called Node. When you select that, there's a bunch of functions that appears, including body entered, body exit, body shape entered. Oh, there's a body shape entered. Interesting. Body shape exited, sleep state, blah, 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 so on and so forth. There's an input event, mouse entered, so on and so forth. What we're going to do in this case is we're going to choose body entered. And then click connect. Or you can just double click on that and it will work just fine. When you do so, you get this. And right now it's asking where to, which script to add our event into. And in this case, I'm going to choose Box Ross because Box Ross actually has a script attached to it. And then here it is on the method name right here. It says on Box Ross body entered. This will obviously change to whatever the function happens to be. You don't need to change this, just to let you know. You probably want to memorize that this is a thing. And click connect. And there we go. We finally have our first node on our visual scripting editor right here. Woo! Box Ross. And so now that we have this, we need to tell it, hey, I want you to actually do something. In this case, I want you to play a sound effect. Well, lo and behold, that is actually really easy to do. You just have to go into here at the very right with the audio stream player, 3D, drag and drop it into here, and that creates a new pop-up. And it's going to ask you which method to call on this node. Well, as it turns out, we want to play our sound effect, so we just have to click void play and then open. And here we go. It creates a call node right here. and we just need to string these two together by dragging and dropping on the left triangle to the right triangle. And there we have it. We created our first script. Anytime on a box ROS, if a body has entered it, then it goes to right here on audio stream player, play that sound effect. Simple enough. So, with that in mind, let's play it, and still no sound effect. Still no sound effects whatsoever. So you might be asking yourself, but I did everything correctly. What's missing? And the answer is this is missing. This right here. You probably did not expect it, but there is actually one more property that you need to change under the inspector. Make sure you have box ROS selected, and then click on the inspector tab again. And right here, there's a check mark called contact monitor. As it turns out, that signal that we created does not get triggered if this is left unchecked. So we want to make sure that contact monitor is checked. And then furthermore, there's contacts reported right above it. We need to set that to a number larger than a 0. So we're going to choose 1, because why not? What this does is that each time a collision has been detected, first off, it will actually trigger on the script that a collision has been detected. Then it has a contacts reported. This is the maximum number of points that that object collided into that it reports to the script. In this case, because we don't care where it's collided into, we just want to know that it collided at all, we're just setting it to 1. That's just it. So now when you play the game in this state, you should now hear a sound effect. So confirm that that works. By the way, I'm going to be extra silly and see if this works. Yes, drag and drop the Crash Course Unity 2D tutorial. And then see if yep, the box is actually playing music. It just restarts it every time it hits something. Anyways, so yeah, that's an option if you want to be creative. Did that work for everyone? Are there any questions? Yes. Anyone else need help? So, quick scripting summary. First off, so if you haven't noticed, basically the visual scripting here, it's basically a graph, right? You can have multiple different nodes. Okay, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to demonstrate that. But you can have multiple different nodes, and basically what it's going to do is it's going, whenever this function triggers, it's going to follow that white line and go to there and try to call that function. Incidentally, there's an object right here. You can also carry over variables. There's a way to represent that. For those who's familiar with blueprints in Unreal, this should be conceptually very similar and something that you should be familiar with. There are something called like conditions as an example, and while loops and so forth that you can use. Where if you use conditionals, then there's a true, out, false, and then done. Done is basically it runs all the time. Versus true, which is when this condition is set to true, only that runs. Otherwise, if it's set to false, it only falls through the false, so on and so forth. So the intent behind it is you just have to follow through where the white line is going, and then it just runs those specific functions, each node being a representation of a specific function. When it reaches to the very end, in which in this case this is the end because there's nothing else, then that function stops running and it's done. In regards to sound, this was also something that I had a hard time researching, but I do know that it's able to import WAV files and OGG files just fine. WAV files are great for sound effects, but they are also very large. They're a lossless format, which means they don't lose any detail. OGG, on the other hand, do lose detail. They're a lossy format, but they're great for music, which is why you might notice that the crash course music is an OGG file versus the other stuff, which is a WAV file. Duplicating the cube, well, there are a couple of different ways to do it. We're going to choose what I consider the best method, which is simply to actually save the static body as a scene. And it's really simple. You just right-click on the static body and say Save Branch as Scene. So let's do that real quick. First off, I'm going to switch to 3D view right here so that we can actually see the 3D view. And I'm going to choose Box Ross. And then right here with Box Ross, I'm going to choose Save Branch as Scene. And it asks you to actually give name to this. I'm just going to call this Box. And then save. And then when you do so, when you return back to your scene, as it turns out, lo and behold, there is a box.tcn that we can now just drag and drop all the way into the game all over the place. But one thing that's actually interesting that you might notice as a consequence of this is, first off, these should not be parented to each other. I'm going to highlight all that and make sure they're parented to spatial instead. But second, and more importantly, is the fact that they now they kind of compressed into a single node. And more importantly, there's now a new icon attached to it too. So this icon simply stands for signal, but this next icon is the scene icon. And what happens is that when you click on that, it actually opens the Box Ross scene in a separate tab up here. So here's the separate tab. So you can actually make edits specifically to Box Ross in this tab, and then switch back to the main level, and then be starting playing that. And all the boxes here, the changes of those will be propagated to all the boxes. So feel free to play around with that.
Is it okay to think of them as prefabs?
Huh?
Or if you're familiar with Unity, they're like kind of prefabs?
Yes, scenes are basically prefabs. Oh, I should have probably clarified that. So I mentioned earlier scenes are like levels. But as it turns out, you can embed scenes into each other as well, which does one thing that Unity does not have. As it turns out, Godot already has a built-in nested prefab system. You can add a scene into a scene, into a scene, into a scene, into a scene, and it'll just handle it just fine. So if you're wondering about, like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of nodes right here. How do I organize that? The answer is you create it into a scene. You can just right-click on something and let it know that I want that to be a scene. This is the level scene. And then there you go. Now it's just compressed into one single thing. If you kind of like Unity's method of doing prefabs where the entire hierarchy is visible in the hierarchy, lo and behold, Godot actually has a built-in method to make that happen as well. You can right-click on something and select Editable Children, and that exposes all the children under that specific scene. And as the name scene implies, you can change each of these properties right here are unique to that specific instance. So again, just like Unity prefabs, you can change those and it will work out just fine. So this is actually one thing where Godot does better than Unity itself.
But can you apply a change and have it populate to the other
Yes, by changing that scene.
You have to open that scene separately, or now that it's a child of this scene, can I edit it in here and populate it through to the other scenes?
As far as I can tell, no. I might be wrong on that, and maybe there actually is a method. But my understanding is that the workflow is you're supposed to edit that scene explicitly. I didn't repeat the question here because the microphone is only catching my voice right here. But the question was, is it possible, like in Unity, to hit an apply button and make it so that any changes that I make on one node is applied to all of them? As far as I'm aware, no. But it's not too hard to open a scene to make those changes anyways. And then it's not too hard to return back to the scene you're in. To return to making changes. In fact, part of the interesting reason why the play button only plays the actual initial scene is because you'll probably be working on your own scene right here, and you're going to think to yourself, maybe I made those changes right. Well, as it turns out, if you press the play button, it'll bring right back to the main level scene. If you click on this scene instead, then it's just not going to show anything because there's no camera in this scene, but it's actually trying to render this scene. Does that make sense?
Taro, if you reorganize, like I accidentally saved my scene, or maybe I was supposed to do that outside of my assets, and then I brought it into my assets, and now it's getting confused because it can't find itself. So apparently you can't just reorganize your widget files.
Yes. Good question. The question was, can I rename my assets in my folder, like the scene name? And the answer is, let's find out. What happens if I rename box.tsn to Ross? Oh, well, that's the FPS controller. Whoops. Oh, it apparently works. So if you rename it in the editor, it looks like it actually propagates those changes. But if you're changing it in the file browser, then you're correct. It will not propagate those changes.
I moved it, but I did.
Oh, you moved it. Let's see what happens if I do that too. Nope, not the visual script. Let's move into the assets folder. No, it's able to find it.
Alright, maybe I just did something special.
But yeah, no, that's a good question. So the way the scene works is, the scene actually is just a text file. You can see it here. Lo and behold, it's just a text file. And then for any sort of scene nodes, it's actually defined in one of these like little quote-unquote things, like parent dot right here. So the reason why it's not able to find it is because the text files has not been updated to include the latest path on the assets, and so it just got really confused. All right, we're almost in the home stretch. If you downloaded this via stream just a few seconds ago, or actually even regardless of the method you tried downloading it, you're gonna be unfortunately in a bit of a rude awakening. But what you're gonna do here is we can actually now export this to an actual executable. And that's easy. You just hit on project right here, boop, project, and then click export. Now, let's see what happens. Okay, this looks fine. Let's click add. And I'm gonna, because I have Windows operating system, I'm gonna use Windows Desktop. If you obviously have a Mac, choose Mac. And then when you do so, it'll give you a selection of being able to export to that platform, give you a bunch of things here. We're gonna ignore everything on the right and just click export project. And then when that happens, it's going to give you a file browser to ask you, where do you want to add this to? I'm going to go one folder up and drop it into this folder right here. Actually, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it build. And then here, I'm going to say to file tutorial. and save. Just let it do its thing. And that's essentially how you export your project to a specific platform. Notice that you can select another different platform, like say HTML5, and then if you hit export, if you select that project, then it exports to HTML5 because I have that selected, versus if I select Windows Desktop selected, and it's going to select that. So now in theory, I should be able to bring it up in this file browser under build right here. And I should be able to run, oh, by the way, notice it created a new PCK file here. That's actually important. The executable must be in the same folder as the PCK file should be in the same folder as the exe, or else the exe will not run. But you should be able to play this. And lo and behold, we are now playing the game. And that's how you make a game in Godot 3. Any questions? Yep. Now, oh, I should have mentioned, so specifically the method I did, it worked. For some of you, you may have to download something. Exporters are downloadable in Godot 3. Yeah. So go to project. Export. Let's say which in this case is Windows. Okay, let's say export project. I'll put up one there, and I'll create a new folder. So actually that's it. That's all I had for this lesson. But if you want me to, I can go into more detail about a couple of other extra nitty-gritty details, such as post-processing. But first off, are there any questions from the whole, after going through this? Were you able to successfully create your game? Yeah. Yeah? Cool. Any questions so far with what we've been dealing with? And my question to all of you is, are you willing to stay here for a little more to talk about some cool visual stuff?
Yeah.
My parents are here.
Your parents are here. Thank you for coming, Will. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, that's fine. All right, well, we'll call it a day for now. But if you go to our techvalleygamespace.com/learn page, let me close this. Right below here is Crash Course Unity Godot. The slides are available right there. And actually, I will be updating that in a little bit. But just to let you know, some of these new updates that you can do, including adding polishing lighting, actually that's one thing I'm willing to really quickly talk about. I forgot to mention this. This is actually kind of useful. Hit directional light. There is shadow group right here. Turn it on. There we go. Now we have shadows. I totally forgot about that. So you probably, the game will probably be a lot easier to play with shadows on, because that's kind of a vital visual information. Look at that. Shadows. Anyways. But yeah, the rest of the slides kind of go over a similar form of polishes, including shadows, post-processing, which if you don't know what post-processing is, they add effects that look something like this, where you can see that it's kind of blurry in the background. That's a depth of field effect. You can also have it so that there's a little glow around objects, so kind of give it like a more sunlight thing. There's kind of eye adjustment, brightness adjustment features, and so forth. There's also here an audio mixer. that you can use to kind of create weird mixes of sound effects. And I also wanted to quickly mention that you probably, all the scripts inside the FPS controller is actually visual scripting. So I highly recommend, if you really want to get into more scripting end of things with Godot, I highly recommend reading through what I did for the FPS controller and see how the visual scripting in that works. It is unfortunately not as straightforward as I like it to be, but just to let you know, there's that opportunity. All right, that's all I had. Are there any questions from the chat?
No, we do not have any questions in the chat.
Sweet.
I got one. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Got a little thirsty in the middle.
I was asking Aaron. Aaron's on the chat.
Hi, Aaron.
How easy would it be to add friction to the, maybe because you did boxes with box ROS automatically add friction. I did spheres, so they just kind of rolled off the edge of the map.
Okay, the question was, how easy is it to add friction into your game? Select box ROS, and here is the friction value, which is set to all the way to 100 of all things, which is really curious and weird. Yeah, it doesn't go over more than 10. That's interesting. But in theory, what's supposed to happen is anything that it can collide into. So the mesh instance right here, there's a scene. Whoops. The static body, you should be able to define the friction here as well, which is also set to 1. Interesting. So I don't know why then the friction is not working as you would expect. There is a bounce, however. That's cool. We can set that to probably like 0.9 and play the game. Yeah, see that? All these happy boxes. To answer your question, I don't know why the friction value is set to maximum and you can still move the boxes around, or the sphere around in your case. That should not be happening. You could alternatively make it so that you constrain the rotation of the sphere so that the sphere cannot rotate. But I don't know if that would save it in any fashion or form. You could also make it so that the mass is really heavy.
I think because really I just want to shoot the balls more before they roll off the map without restarting the scene. So the easiest fix would be to put up a wall and do like an arena. So that I guess
the bullets themselves are programmed to disappear after 1 second. So yeah.
Taro, I wonder what this error
Let me take a quick look. There is an error, is the question.
I noticed that it's the same for as many boxes as I have.
The answer is I don't know.
Also, I noticed that when I launched my game as just an application, I could see the scripts in the background. It was
Oh yeah, there was a console.
So maybe there's just like something simple in the scripting.
No. Give me a minute. That is a good question. (64-bit) release, resources, patches, features. Okay, I guess that's just the way the exporter, unfortunately, exports the game project. I thought there was an option to remove the console in here, but at first glance, it looks like the answer is no. So, I don't know, sorry. But By the way, if you're curious, if you were to actually close that command prompt, it will close the entire game as well. But yeah, no, it doesn't look like there's an option to remove that command prompt.
I'm gonna stop the stream.
Sweet. By the way, watch your eyes. I'm going to turn on the lights.
Alright, thanks for everyone who came by.